Welcome back. At this point, we have a working database and the ability to add new request handlers to our application. So in this video, I'll walk you through each route one by one and explain the intended functionality before actually implementing them. The first thing I'll do is import another Flask method into this routes file. The method I'm importing is called abort, and this is going to return an error, an HTTP error for the handler. I'm importing this because I'm about to flesh out all of these endpoints, but I'm not going to put any code into them. I'm just going to be defining the routes and the method that they take. All of them for now are just going to return an error, which is an HTTP 501 not implemented error. So the handler's there, but the code isn't implemented yet. After that, I'm going to get rid of these test routes. And the first real route will be for the index. This is going to be without any path parameter on our web application. This is just the index page, the first page they see. And the method is going to be get. Now this handler is going to handle the main feed. So when you go to our feed reader, all of the new articles, the unread articles from every source are going to be listed on this page. And they'll all have, their title and a little summary and a link that you can click on to read the article. But for now, it's just going to return that error. 501. Okay, the next endpoint, the next handler that I want to implement is going to be the one that's responsible for flagging the article as being read and redirecting them to the actual URL of that article. And that's going to be at this read or read endpoint, this path on our application. But it's going to take a path variable, which is the article ID. And let me type this out before I try to explain that. Okay, so when you put something in these brackets in the URL pattern for Flask, what it's saying is this is a variable in the URL. And whatever you name that variable will be passed to that variable name in the function parameter list. So if you were to visit this web application at read 42, then 42 will be passed in as this article ID. So in this case, what it's going to do is it's going to flag that article as being read. So it's going to change its unread status. And then it's just going to redirect them to the URL for that article. So then that article won't show up in the feed anymore, and they will have already seen the real article and will consider it read. But for now, it's also just going to be a 501, not implemented. So the next route that I want to implement or outline is for the sources. A get method. And this is going to list all of the current sources that are added to the application. So every feed, basically every feed that they're subscribed to, this will list them all. And it'll give them a form to add new sources. But again, for now, we're 501 error. And finally, since there's going to be a form on that sources get page, that form has to post somewhere to add a new source. So that's going to be this sources post handler. So what they fill in the form here, which will probably just be a feed URL, it's going to post to this handler, and that's going to add that source to the database, and then probably just return them a redirect back to this page so they can add more, or maybe return them to the index. These are just an outline of how I think the application should work. We might end up changing these later, but this is the basic functionality that will be required for our feed reader to work in a functional manner. But again, it's not going to do anything. We'll just return a 501. And now I can start implementing these endpoints. The first thing I'm going to do is import our models, because we're going to be working with our data. So from models.article, we'll import our article model. And then from models.source, we'll import our source model. Now let's start on this index handler. Like I said, this one's going to pull all of the unread articles, and we're going to display them all in a nice little feed with all the links and the titles and summaries. But first I'm just going to implement the query, which we'll use SQL Alchemy to do. The model itself has this query attribute, and this gives us a query object that we can then add filters and order by clauses and things like that. So we're going to first add a filter to this query. And the filter is going to keep all of the articles for which article.unread equals true. So this is just going to be saying, hey, we're only working with unread articles. And then I can use the order by method, and now I can specify some order column, and that's going to be done on the date published field. Actually, let's go back to the model. It's possible for date published to be null. This is kind of just a decision of preference, whether we want to trust the feed source for the published date to do our ordering, or we want to do the ordering by the date that they're added. I think I'm actually going to do the date that they're added, so that articles are going to show up in the date that our feed reader finds them, rather than the date that the feed source advertises as being when it was published. And this little desk stands for descending. This method means that we want the articles to be ordered by the date added in descending order. So the newest articles are actually going to be on top. And then we should be able to just say articles equals query.all. So every line here I'm redefining this query variable, and it's constructing this SQL select statement basically. And you can kind of look at it as like, we're gonna select from the article table where the unread column is true, and then we're gonna order by the date added descending. It really does correlate to the SQL statements. Now that we have our articles, I'm going to, just to test things really quick, I'll have this handler return a string of the article query converted to a list. I'm not even sure what the representation of each article in this case will look like, but if we get some list as output in string form, then we know that it's actually getting the articles. So that would be a good sign. Let's go to the terminal. Python 3 run. Now let's open up the browser. To localhost. We're still on port 5000. We got an internal server error. So let's open up the terminal and see what happened. This means that I goofed somewhere, and I think it's going to be in the model definition. If I remember correctly, this back reference actually has to be a keyword argument. I'm not sure how I missed that originally. Anyway, let's try that again. Control C to stop the server. Start it back up. Now I'll go to the browser. Okay, so it looks like the representation is blank for each one, but it does actually look like it's returning a list of articles. Let's do a quick experiment and go back to the editor. And I'm going to say article.title for article in articles. So doing a little list comprehension here to grab the title from each of these articles and return it as a list. And then we'll just take a string of that list. So this should actually give us some results. Let's restart our server. Back to the browser. And there we go. So it is returning the articles. Obviously it doesn't look very pretty because we're just taking a string representation of a list. But for now, this just shows us that the query is working. In the next video, I'll show how to use templates to create, to actually render some HTML from a list of articles. But this works. So now I'll move on to the read article handler. And we've got this article ID. We're going to need to grab an article by the article ID. Actually, there's one thing I want to change first. This pattern here, how it matches this variable portion of the path, we can actually use a little type hint. And Flask will actually parse this portion of the path as an integer. So now our article ID will be an integer. And we want that because it's the primary key for our article table. So now I'm going to grab an article by the article ID. And similar to up here, this article.query gives us a query object that we can then use methods to extend. And the get method is going to give us a lookup by the article ID, by the primary key. So now we should have our article. Obviously I'm not doing any error handling here, and I should be, but bear with me. We can fix all that later. We're going to change the unread property to be false. So we're reading the article, which means it's no longer going to be unread in the database. And then we're working in this database session, so we have to commit it after we've changed it. And then we imported this redirect method. And I can actually just redirect to the article link there. So when they go to this, they'll go to, /read/ whatever the primary key of that article they're reading is. It's going to flag that article as being read, so unread is going to be false. It's going to commit that change and then just redirect them to the link. And we can probably check this right now. Restart the server. I'll go back here. I know that the first article, which since we're working in descending order, will actually be this last one. So this NASA TV coverage article, if I go to read article 1, it should flag this as unread and redirect us to the NASA page for this article. So, fingers crossed, see if it works. It's an internal server error. This keeps happening. Alright, we'll go to the terminal and see what we did wrong. It's because I didn't import the DB. I'll show you what happened. So I did this db.session.commit, but I didn't say from db import db. That's an easy fix. Let's do all this again. Bloop. Back to the browser. Okay, now fingers crossed. It redirected us to the page. So the page actually was this NASA astronaut available for interviews. Okay, so here's what we had before. Now if I refresh this, yeah, that article is gone. So it's no longer listed on our feed. Actually, I know why it wasn't the last one on the list now, and it's because it was going by the date that they were added, and the feed was parsed from top to bottom. We may want to actually reverse the feed parsing the way that they're added to the database, because we want the bottom ones in the RSS feed to actually be added first, especially that first time that the feeds are all parsed, where every article is a new article. So that's interesting. Again, we could go by the publish date, but that's an easy change for one, and I think this will work out better in the meantime. So now I can move on to the next handler, which will be this sources get method. So this is going to list all the sources. It's actually going to be a lot like this article list method. So basically I'm going to say query equals source.query to grab that query attribute from our source model. And then I'll say query equals query.order by. This time I'll order it by the title, so it'll be in alphabetical order. And then sources equals query.all. And then as a quick test, I'll say source.title for source and sources. Let's go check that out. And of course, there's only one source right now, so that's the one we see. And finally, we have to handle this last route here, which is the post for the sources. So a new source is going to be posted here. Let's say that this source requires a feed URL. We'll get the feed from the form. So basically a form is going to be submitted here that has a feed variable or a field named feed. That's going to contain our feed URL. We'll pull that out of the form. We will parse the feed but the feed module isn't imported here, so import feed. So now we've got this parsed feed. We know that we can get the source from it using our feed module again. So get source is called on the parsed feed, and we can use this insert from feed method, this class method we defined earlier, and pass the feed source. So we also have to pass the feed URL and the feed source. So feed URL, the feed source, and that should add the source. Then I'll just do a redirect here to go back to the sources list so you can add another feed. Now at this point I don't have a way of testing this that's easy to explain in this video because there's no form, there's no HTML to submit the form. There are tools you can use, sure, but for simplicity's sake I'm just gonna assume that this works. Hopefully this works. We'll come back to this in the next video when we start adding templates to this application. So if you want to learn how to add templates to this, check out the next video, and until then, bye!